Hey guys, and welcome back to Microsoft Flight Simulator. Over the last couple of days, I've gone through the graphics settings of the simulator and have made some adjustments here and there to try and get the system looking as good as possible on a relatively modest system. So compared to a lot of YouTubers and streamers out there who have the top-end systems with the latest features and graphics cards, my computer is certainly a lot more modest, running an i7-6700 processor, a GTX1660 graphics card with 16GB of RAM. And so the aim of this video is to go through all my graphics settings, show you guys what I'm running as well as the tweaks I've been doing since the weekend, to give you guys the relative benchmark of what the simulator will look like on a medium to high spec system. So as you can see, in terms of the ground texture and ground settings right now, things are certainly looking a lot more crisp, a lot more sharp. The FPS counter on top left of the screen there, showing you what the simulator is running right now, and overall, things are certainly looking a lot better than they were with my first couple of videos. And so, for sure as well, I'll be showing you guys what I've done to achieve this on a relatively average PC that the normal consumer probably owns, if not very similar to what I've currently got. So, as you have seen, no matter where and what I am flying regards to the aircraft, I am averaging around 45 to 50 FPS with no issues whatsoever. And so, the first thing you're going to want to do, especially if you are running a weaker graphics card, is to overclock. On screen now are my MSI Afterburner settings, and so let me run through each stage and what you should be expected to do. First things first is the core voltage and power limits. Whilst messing around with the setting does give a warning on MSI telling you that doing so may damage your graphics cards, on most modern systems the BIOS will automatically limit the power voltage, and therefore you don't expect to see any damage whatsoever to your system, and therefore it is possible to increase both to 100 without too many problems. However, in the case of NVIDIA cards, do be aware that one thing they do by default is overvolts. And so what NVIDIA have in place is a system where your GPU will automatically draw more power than it actually needs, because they believe that when you get your card, the first thing you'll do is overclock it. And so there's a good video online about undervolting and running less power into your GPU to both increase the cooling of your system as well as not affect your system performance in any way whatsoever. I've linked it in the top right corner of the screen, feel free to give that a watch if it's interesting to you. Next we come up to the temperature limits. Now on most modern systems, when your system hits around 75 degrees centigrade, your GPU will start to thermal throttle, and what that does is it pulls back all of your settings to stop it from overheating and then again potentially damaging your cards. Now while GPUs are certainly durable, and therefore running it slightly over the 75 threshold won't cause you too many problems, the link here is also linked to the power limits. Therefore if you were to run it at 75 degrees centigrade, it would bring your power usage down to 80%, and therefore I personally don't mind having it a little bit over. Now we come on to your core clock and your memory clock. And so the rule of the thumb when setting this up is to run a benchmark tool. For example, I use Guru 3D's Heaven, and to increase both these options by 50 each time until your system becomes unstable. Then what you want to do is lower it by 25 until your system runs smoothly again, before putting it through a heavy duty test. So running a modern game at all high spec until things are running stable again. Any instabilities then, you decrease both settings by 10 until you are happy with your setup and happy with your overclock. Finally, we come on to fan speeds. Now this is something that I have tweaked, and I'll show you my settings here. So on screen, you can see my curve, and what it does is it will slowly increase until you get to around 70 degrees centigrade, and then push for 100% usage. That way, it gives my system that extra room to cool if needed, as well as allowing the fan to flow the air through the system, while also at lower temperatures as well. And all that goes hand in hand with the power limits and temperature limits, allowing your system to run at a higher spec without too much of a problem. Now, let's take a closer look at the graphics settings within Microsoft Flight Simulator. Firstly, as I am running a 1080p display, I left my mode at full screen with the resolution at 1920 by 1080. On a medium high-spec system, you could almost certainly run the simulator at 1440p without too much problem, but don't be expecting 4K anytime soon, that's for sure. Now, as we scroll down, this is where all the graphics customizations are. For the most part, I have my simulator set to high, with a few options even running on ultra, and so let's go through them all one by one, shall we? Firstly, we have render scaling. What this does is it renders the in-sim world at a higher or lower resolution than what your monitor is actually outputting. So for example, if I were to have the render scale set to 50%, what the sim would do is try and scale it as if I was running a 540p monitor. And likewise, if I were to have it set to 200%, what it would try and do is double the pixels, double the level of detail, and try and run at a 2160p or 4K resolution on my 1080p screen. The higher the value, the crisper and sharper textures and models are, but this does certainly come at an FPS cost. Next up is anti-aliasing. What this does is it minimises the distortion and artifacts that appear on the edge of buildings and 3D models. This comes with 3 levels: FXAA, DLAA and TAA, with each algorithm in that order producing a better output image. FXAA and DLAA are both rather well optimised and don't see any drop in performance, while TAA only gives you a very slight reduction, but certainly well worth having. Next we come up to terrain level of detail. What this does is determine how many objects will be visible in the simulated scenery world. The higher the slider, the more objects that appear, but also at an FPS cost. This is both CPU and GPU intensive, and therefore, depending on the spec you have, will determine how high you can set it before you start seeing a massive drop in your frames. Tessellation quality next, and this is certainly something that doesn't cause any major effect to your simulator, if at all. Most modern GPUs can handle it without any issue, and therefore setting it to ultra won't cause too many problems regardless of what your system spec is. Now we come on to buildings. The higher the setting here, the more detail that come into the buildings that populate the 3D world. At lower settings, this may mean removing some of the smaller details such as air conditioning vents on roofs of houses, or level of detail alongside walls and windows. I have mine set to high personally, but if your system can run the extra shaders, then certainly it is worth bumping it up to ultra. When it comes to trees, the 4 settings are very different from one another. On its minimum setting, trees appear to be very high in contrast and also look very flat and billboard-like, while on the medium setting, one step up, they start to look a lot more lush and 3D. The high and ultra setting then takes this up to the next level, while also increasing the world's tree density. Bushes and grass is another setting that also has a very wide range between the different modes. First, you can turn them off completely and remove all grass sprites within the world as a whole. Then between low, medium, high and ultra, what this does is it increases the density of the grass within the simulator, as well as also increase the render distance of when it starts appearing and when it starts to fade. The next setting on the list is the object's level of detail. Now this option is certainly CPU heavy, while not appearing to do too much from the front end, and therefore it is recommended to leave it at the default 100 level. Now we have volumetric clouds. The higher this setting, the better the sky environment looks, by increasing the resolution of the global clouds. Under the low and medium settings, clouds certainly don't look too good and appear as just flat white blobs floating in the sky, and therefore I certainly would recommend running it high as a minimum, and ultra if your system can handle it. Texture resolution determines how compressed and detailed the textures are within the simulator. While certainly not affecting your CPU or GPU performance, it can start to become very heavy on your graphics card VRAM depending on how high your resolution is and how much memory you have available. While on low, it uses around 6,175 megabytes of VRAM, while on ultra pushes up to 7,190. As my GTX 1660 only has 6GB of VRAM, I personally have dropped this down to the high mode, but once again, if you can run it on Ultra, then it's certainly worth doing so. Anisotropic filtering removes some of the texture blur that's caused by MIP mapping. A MIP map is a smaller, compressed version of a texture image, and will be used to display objects further away from your current position as part of the level of detail radius, or LOD. Having this option to a high level doesn't cause too much strain to your system, and is well worth having if you can push for it. Next we have texture super sampling, which acts as an anti-aliasing for textures. Now visually, this seems to do very little for your simulator, especially if you've got your aliasing set to TAA. If you are however using one of the lower anti-aliasing modes, then it may be worth setting it to 2x2, but certainly no more higher than that, as it does not appear to do very much at all for the simulator. Now we come on to texture synthesis, and what this does is it constructs a model out of a large digital image based on its structural content. So for example, if you were to have a texture sheet of a gravel path, what the simulator would then do is try to construct a bump map out of it, depending on the information that the texture gives it. Regardless of what you've got this set to, it doesn't appear to do too much in terms of your frame rate. What WaterWaves does is determine the resolution of bodies of water within the simulator. The higher the setting, the higher the fidelity, but at the same time, the higher the FPS cost. Medium and high don't appear to have too much of a difference between the two, but do seem to give you a relatively significant amount of reduction in your frames, and therefore you'd be better off leaving it in the medium setting more than anything else. Now we come on to the shadow settings, starting off with the shadow maps. What a shadow map does is it splits the model up into a grid, and so the higher the shadow map resolution, the more grid lines there are, and so the simulator will use the setting to determine how the light is hitting the surface, and therefore how dark it should shade that section compared to the next ones around it. The three lower settings seem to have a very similar level of performance on the GPU, while pushing it to 2048 does give you a slight reduction, but not by much. Then we have the terrain shadows, which determines the resolution of shadows, this time on the world scenery below. Now this option is certainly GPU heavy, and the higher the resolution, the more frames you are set to use. If you are running a weaker GPU, then turning this setting down will certainly see you a boost. Contact shadows determine the shadow sharpness when coming into contact with either your aeroplane or the ground. The higher the setting, the better they look, and once again, the higher settings don't seem to do too much in terms of reducing your overall frame rates, and therefore leaving it on Ultra doesn't cause you too much of a problem, while also improving your visual quality. Windshield effects determine how good external influences look when making contact with your window. The higher the setting, the more dense and smaller raindrops appear, for example. Setting this to low, medium, high have minimum effect on your GPU performance, while setting it to Ultra does start to give it a jump. Now we come on to ambient occlusion. What it is a rendering technique that is used to calculate how exposed the simulator should be depending on what aspects of it you are looking at. Once again, the difference between low, medium, high are minimal in terms of CPU and GPU performance, while vastly improving how well the simulator looks, while Ultra sees a massive jump in terms of GPU usage, which can see a massive reduction in your overall frame rate. Leaving this setting on high is both best for performance, while also increasing your overall visual fidelity, both with shadows and lighting overall. Reflections next, and this is both relatively heavy for both your CPU and GPU. While I'm sure I don't need to explain what a reflection is, the higher the setting you have here, the better the reflected image looks on surfaces, whether that be your aircraft wing or coming off the water. Light shafts are the beam of light that come off of your aircraft's taxi and landing lights. This setting has no effect on your FPS, regardless of whether you're on low or ultra, and therefore you can leave it on ultra. Bloom adds a level of distortion to your scenery, especially in really bright areas. When your viewpoint is focused on one part of the aircraft, anywhere around that is in a brighter or darker level will appear brighter or darker, similar to how your eye works when adjusting to different light levels. Once again, this has a minimal impact on your simulator and therefore can be left on. Depth of field next, and this is an option that only appears either in the in-game menu or when using drone cam. What this does is control your level of detail depending on what you're focused on. This means images in both the foreground and background can appear blurry and therefore can be used to give you extra effects when taking screenshots. Once again, with absolutely no difference between the minimum and ultra setting, you can leave this on max without any problems whatsoever. Now we come to lens correction, and what this does is remove some artifacts caused by the camera when using high fields of view. This is an effect that doesn't happen too much for most people, and therefore you can leave it off, but regardless of your setting, this does not affect your CPU or GPU in any way, and won't affect your frames at all. Penultimately, we come to lens flare. Whenever you look directly at the sun, small rings will appear on the camera lens, just as if you were taking a photo. Once again, this has no impact to your system and therefore can be left on without causing any degradation to your frames. And finally, generic plane models. Within Microsoft Flight Simulator, there are two sets of planes, the player aircraft and the AI aircraft. AI aircraft are of a lower quality with less polygons and therefore much easier to run, especially if you have numerous aircraft. However, especially when it comes to multiplayer traffic, the generic planes don't have functioning air surfaces and can be very limited with their animations. With generic plane models turned off for multiplayer traffic, if you were to fly next to somebody else, any input they make, you will also be able to see. This also includes for lights and other surface animations too. Therefore, I would certainly recommend leaving the generic plane models on for the AI traffic, but turning it off for the multiplayer craft. So, those were the graphics settings. Now take a look at the data. What this page does is determine your online connectivity, as well as your Bing Maps streaming options, and also any limitations you may place, for example on your download bandwidth, in case you may be running a meter service or on a limited internet connection. So, first of all, online functionality. This is the master switch for everything. So if you want to be able to see the Bing Maps data, if you want to see the AI traffic, if you want to see the multiplayer and weather, for example, turn this option on. Next we come to Bing Data World Graphics, and so what this is the streaming data from Bing Maps. So this is the satellite images across the world, and what makes the simulator look as good as it does. Next is the photogrammetry, and this is a bit more of a limited option, and I'll explain why. In select regions of the world, Bordeaux, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, New York, and a couple of other places as well, what it does is instead of using the Azure AI placed buildings that most of the world has, instead, if you ever use Google Maps and go to the Earth mode, you'll know that some buildings are 3D because the maps kind of sticks them out of the ground. It uses a mesh and actually creates 3D models based on just the images alone, with nothing else placed on top. And so Bing has a similar option as well, and what the photogrammetry is the 3D buildings that are generated off the satellite data, not off of manually placed buildings. And so this is certainly an FPS killer, but in the few cities that have it, is by far the best looking, because rather than having generic buildings in the place of real ones, they have the real buildings themselves in their correct places. And so another option that, if you can handle it, absolutely turn it on. Now we have the real world air traffic. So if I head on over to the main menu, the world map, and zoom into the US for example, and find somewhere with busy airways. So right now over New York, lots of little airplane symbols, and all of these are real airplanes that are flying right now as I'm recording this. So over here we have version 688 and Airbus A350-1000, currently going from JFK to London Heathrow. If I look at another aeroplane, we have you. You're going to be private traffic, coming into land right now at an airport I don't quite know the name of. If I go find another aeroplane somewhere a bit more continental, we have you, Alpha Yankee 863. You're an Airbus A320, currently at 70,000 feet, heading towards this airport from here. And so what this does is essentially it determines what places the real-world aircraft data into the simulator, and at the same time also controls it for AI use as well. And so a very cool feature that is new to flight simulation, and one that I very much do enjoy, especially the fact that you can actually click on an aeroplane, take over its flight plan, and then resume the rest of the flight as if you were that plane itself. Next is live weather. Self-explanatory. It lets you download METAR information from around the world through the Meteo Blue service, and well, it just injects it into the simulator as is. And then finally, multiplayer. And so again, self-explanatory. This is what lets you connect to other players with Microsoft Flight Simulator, and you can then spot them within the sim. And if you were to turn on the name tags, for example, as well under traffic, then also shows you their username. It will show you their aircraft type, as well as a few other small bits of information as well. Now, the data consumption page. What this does is it controls your download speeds as well as any limitations you may have placed. So if you were on a metered limit or have a certain amount of data you can use in a day, you can turn on limitation, and for example I have 50 gigs of or 60 gigs of internet a day. You can tell it to use 60, and also a warning just beforehand before you're about to run out. Down below that you then have bandwidth, and depending on your internet service provider's speeds, you can then set limitations based on what you've got. Now, for those who recall the blurry textures of my early videos of Microsoft Flight Simulator, what I had done is inadvertently set my limits to 5 megabytes per second. And so while I believed I had 40, in reality it was set to 5. I'm not sure if it was by default or if I did it by accident, but I do want to apologise to both Asobo and Microsoft right now, as what I've inadvertently done is run it at a limited internet download speed without realising it, and as a result led to a few blurry textures here and there. I have now boosted up to 40, which is my actual ISP's limit, and so going forward things should look a lot crisper now as well. But once again, I do apologise to all who I've inadvertently misled by not being, well, even myself not knowing that that was the case. Finally then you have the rolling cache, and what that does is it stores the downloaded data for a certain amount of time. And so if you're flying between two airports and you're flying over a certain area, it will download the information off of the servers. So for example off of Bing Maps, the photogrammetry, it'll download it into the location you set, in this case the default folder, and then store it for a certain period of time before eventually clearing it out as any cache would. And so with that comes to an end of our quick tour of the graphic settings within Microsoft Flight Simulator. And like I say, for a medium high-end system, you're still not getting that low of a experience for sure. Microsoft Flight Simulator's minimum requirements are very low for what they are. I mean, very low RAM requirements, not the most modern graphics card in the 940, I believe, GTX. And certainly, even with some of the lower settings, you're getting a very good simulator out of it as well. So, I hope this video has helped in giving you guys a better understanding of Microsoft Flight Simulator's graphics settings, as well as giving you guys an idea of a benchmark based on a medium to high system spec PC in terms of FPS and in-sim settings. If you did enjoy this video, then please do consider giving us a like as well as a subscription as well, as the amount of support and growth I've seen from this channel recently has been absolutely phenomenal, and trust me, it has just completely blown me away. Likewise, do check out flightsim.com as well, where I've got a couple of articles on the way for them regarding some of the aspects of Microsoft Flight Simulator as well, and certainly they will be worth the read, including a bit more of an in-depth written article on the simulator graphic settings and system specs, which will be up in the next couple of days. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I will see you guys again hopefully in the very near future. Take care, and goodbye.